Welcome everyone, and thank you for joining us today at our very exciting webinar, The Intersection Between Environmental Evidence and Environmental Decisions. I'm Albana Burberry. I am a Journal Development Specialist at Canadian Science Publishing, also joined by fellow webinar co-organizer and Journal Development Specialist Hilary Belleville, who will be moderating the chat today for audience Q&A later on, and also technical support by Rebecca Michaels-Walker. Canadian Science Publishing recognizes and respects the inherent and treaty rights of all Indigenous peoples across the land known as Canada and worldwide, and whose territories we and our research contributors are privileged to live, work, and learn on. We commit to dismantling structures in science publishing that have harmed Indigenous peoples, lands, and knowledges, and to honoring the expertise of Indigenous knowledge keepers past, present, and emerging in pursuit of a just and sustainable future for all. We gratefully acknowledge the Algonquin and Anishinaabe Nation, on whose unceded and unsurrendered territory our Ottawa head office is located, and the area from which I am joining from today. I invite you all to let us know where you're joining in from in the chat, recognizing treaties where applicable so we can celebrate the diverse lands that we call home. Today's exciting panel will be moderated by Dr. Steve Cook, professor at Carleton University and director of the Canadian Centre for Evidence-Informed Conservation. We will hear from our wonderful speakers, Dr. Andrew Cadicalo from the Government of Nunavut, Dr. Paul Snellgrove from Memorial University, and unfortunately, Dr. Rachel Wallander couldn't make it today, but in her place, we are joined by Dr. Cody Day from Environment and Climate Change Canada. Today's webinar is a partnership between Canadian Science Publishing and the Centre for Evidence-Informed Conservation, and is the second in its series. We encourage you to check out the first webinar earlier this year that is now on YouTube. A bit of background about who we are at Canadian Science Publishing. We are an independent, not-for-profit publisher and who places researchers at the heart of our operations. We are researcher-led and community-focused, and we work together to move research forward. We publish some of Canada's longest-running and most respected scientific journals, which were initiated by Canada's National Research Council many years ago. We are committed to advancing excellence in scientific journal publishing through openness, ethics, and collaboration, and have active partnership with over 35 scholarly societies and organizations, including our proud partnership with the Canadian Centre for Evidence-Informed Conservation. Through this partnership, we will empower researchers and decision makers, create a community of practice related to evidence synthesis and use, and offer tangible methods and resources to enable evidence-informed decision-making, policy, and practice in Canada and beyond. We have 6 journals in this partnership, including Arctic Science, so a quick plug for our current open call of papers similar to today's theme on knowledge mobilization in the Arctic, where the journal invites contributors on knowledge mobilization strategies, including co-production, synthesis, creative approaches like podcasts, and land-based activities, with submissions accepted until January 31st. So we encourage you to check this out if you would like to submit your paper to this call for papers. And with that, I would like to pass the mic to our moderator today, Dr. Steve Cook.
Hey, thanks so much, Albana. Really good to see everybody. I guess just by way of introduction, I'll note that the reason I started this center in 2014 was out of frustration. I was, being a good academic and publishing papers, and at the same time was feeling that they weren't having the impact that I necessarily wanted them to have or expected them to have. And that's when I started really drilling into understanding that whole ecosystem, from those that generate knowledge to those that use knowledge. And what we're talking about today is one of the facets of that. There's a lot of complexity here. And exploring this topic really means digging into a variety of allied, I'm a fish biologist by training. The fish biology space in particular isn't going to offer solutions here. It means really delving into the social sciences, understanding how knowledge moves, understanding knowledge mobilization, translation, and spending time interacting with practitioners and decision makers to really understand how they go about their business. I will note today the panel, as well as myself, we are all settlers. That's important in that informs the perspective that we bring to the table. It's the day before Orange Shirt Day here in Canada, where we acknowledge the historic wrongs and try to pave a path forward towards reconciliation with our Indigenous peoples. Along those lines, I just wanted to give everybody a heads up that we will be developing another webinar that will focus specifically on what these topics mean in the context of Indigenous knowledge and knowledge systems. So stay tuned for that. You'll hear, we hope to do that in the next few months. So with that, I'd like to offer an opportunity for each of our three speakers to introduce themselves. And we're going to start off with Dr. Andrew Katakolo. Oh, I should also say, while they are introducing themselves, they're also going to tell us a little bit about what the word evidence means to them in the context of their jobs or lived experiences. Thanks.
Thanks, Steve. Hi, everybody. I'm Andrew. I work for the government of Nunavut currently in the role of social science researcher. My job is to help gather and mobilize Inuit knowledge on wildlife species into wildlife co-management decisions. Wildlife that we primarily focus on are traditional terrestrial species harvested for subsistence, that being caribou, polar bear, and muskox. And so when Steve asked the question about what evidence means in my working context, that means very much scientifically generated information or knowledge to support wildlife management. So that's we have a team of primarily Western scientists that conduct aerial surveys and other types of surveys on those species, as well as importantly, inserting Western science alongside Inuit knowledge. Lived experiences, generational knowledge, local knowledge, on the ground knowledge about these species to help inform co-management decisions of those species. And in addition to my government of Nunavut hat, some of my perspectives on this panel are also informed by being a researcher on evidence-informed decision-making. So I did my PhD in Dr. Cook's lab, looking at evidence-informed decision-making, the extent of it in freshwater fisheries management in British Columbia. And then we've also done some research exploring evidence-informed decision-making in environmental management and conservation across the country and federal and provincial and territorial governments, as well as NGOs. So I also share some of those perspectives as well from those that we have talked to and interviewed.
Thank you very much. Professor Snellgrove.
Thank you, Steve. Hi, everybody. I'm Paul. I'm a professor of ocean sciences and biology at Memorial University of Newfoundland and Labrador. I'm a marine ecologist by training, but most relevant to today, I've just finished a 5-year term as departmental science advisor to Fisheries and Oceans Canada. So evidence to me refers to the best available information supported by objective studies and knowledge, noting that expertise and knowledge can come in many different forms. Evidence should be sufficiently comprehensive to address the question, it should be unbiased, it should avoid advocacy, and it should be up to date. And I'll leave it at that. Thanks.
Thank you very much. And last but not least, Dr. Day. And again, I just want to acknowledge, thanks again for stepping in for Dr. Valender, who was last minute unable to join us. We appreciate you doing this with about 5 hours notice. Thank you.
Yeah, no problem, Steve. And Rachel passes on her apologies. She had a family emergency today, so apologies to you and to everyone in attendance that I'm not as advertised, but hopefully I can provide some insight. My name is Cody. I'm a science advisor at Environment and Climate Change Canada in the Wildlife and Landscape Science Directorate. My role in ECCC is mostly as a knowledge broker. So I try to bring together scientific evidence when the department needs it to inform decisions. And this takes a lot of different forms. It depends a lot on the evidence needs. It depends a lot on the evidence availability. But hopefully I can get a little bit more into that later in the panel. Our team also has a role to do some research on science advice and can provide a small plug for Canadian Science Publishing. We've recently published a paper looking at 600 pieces of publicly available science advice that was provided to the Government of Canada over the last 25 years. That's just come out in the last couple of months, and we're doing some other research as well on conflict of interest policies for science advisory mechanisms that we've at least submitted it to a CSP journal. So look for that coming out. So I sort of skipped over my thoughts on evidence. I kind of think of evidence as the subset of information that provides some predictive capability as to how a decision will roll out and the outcome of a decision. And so, this information can come from many different sources. Our team, being within the science and technology branch of ECCC, deals primarily with scientific evidence. And primarily, although not exclusively, with evidence from the natural sciences. We do occasionally have relevant social science expertise to bring to bear, but it's not as much as the natural science expertise that we have. I will say that the Government of Canada, of course, considers many different types of evidence, and not just scientific evidence. They consider economic evidence, legal expert opinions, local knowledge, Indigenous knowledge. So there's many different forms of evidence out there, in my opinion. But the kind of specific niche that our team works in is mainly focused on natural science. Stop there.
Great. Thanks, Cody. Thanks to everybody for those introductions. And just for our audience, there's opportunity for you to ask questions. We will hold your questions till after we've gone through a series of structured questions just to lead things off, but you can enter those questions at any point in time when they come to you. So don't hesitate to do that. There's the chat or the Q&A function that you can use for submitting questions. So the first question that I'm going to ask of everyone, all of you are involved in different organizations and you play somewhat different roles in that evidence-informed decision-making ecosystem. Based on your experiences, what does evidence-informed decision-making look like in your context? And can you provide a success story? We've sort of moved away from this idea of evidence-based to evidence-informed. That makes things to some a little bit more wishy-washy, but I think is probably a little bit more realistic. And it's always a win when we've got evidence at the table informing decisions. So can you give us a success story as well? I'm going to start with Dr. Snellgrove on this, and then we'll go to Dr. Day, and then Dr. Katakalo.
All right, thanks, Steve. So, of course, I'm going to speak in the context of my DFO experience, because that's where a lot of my evidence thinking is based. And, I'll start by saying that the three pillars for evidence-based decision-making at DFO are inclusion of the best available objective science advice, a process that is transparent as much as possible, and also embracing open data. And I'm going to say a little bit about each of those categories. So I've recently been involved with DFO's efforts to enhance its Canadian Scientific Advisory Secretariat, or CSAS process, which is the primary vehicle which brings science expertise and scientists together to try and address questions on which DFO requires scientific advice, whether that advice is for a science question, a management question, or a policy-related question. And so starting with evidence-based science advice, it really begins with assembling an expert meeting. And so typically CSAS meetings draw in maybe about 30 or so experts that span the expertise that's needed to address the question, and that evaluation team comprises entirely experts and not advocates. And so these experts could come from DFO, they could come from academia, from NGOs, and sometimes international organizations, but they must commit to objective, evidence-based science and not opinion. And so I've been involved in CSAS meetings as an expert and as a co-chair over the years, and I would say that all of the meetings were successful in producing the best scientific advice available, while acknowledging sources of uncertainty, which is something I suspect we'll get into a little later. So the second pillar, which is open science, means publishing the outcomes of the meeting in publicly accessible documents that anyone can obtain, with clear scientific recommendations and caveats, noting that CSAS is entirely focused on the science and does not consider the economic and other social issues. These are also important sources of evidence, of course, but it's not the purpose of CSAS. So a key challenge here is that these documents can often be somewhat technical in nature. And one area where DFO is trying to up their game is through clear, plain language communication of their scientific advice and the basis for it. So it's not an easy task, but it's one that they do recognize as quite important. So the third pillar then is open data, which defines evidence-based decision-making, and that the data accessibility offers anyone an opportunity to try and analyze that data, reanalyze it if they wish to do so, and to see if they agree that the evidence there supports the decision that has been made. Steve asked about a success story, so I will mention one. I'll note this is a CSAS review I was not part of myself, but it's one that stands out in my mind. And it was a review that synthesized the state of environmental knowledge of marine waters on the Nunatsiavut coast of Labrador. And although this is not a particularly controversial topic, it managed the complex task of braiding Western and Indigenous knowledge successfully into a single comprehensive report that's proven to be tremendously useful for DFO, for academic researchers such as me, and also for the Inuit as they develop their marine conservation plan, known as Imapivit. So I'll leave it there and pass it on. Thanks.
Great. Thanks, Paul. Over to you, Cody.
Okay, thanks, Stephen. Thanks, Paul. I guess I'd just start this answer to this question by saying that I don't see our team as being directly involved in evidence-informed the decision-making side of things. And so my perspective on this question comes from, what's success in terms of providing the right evidence at the right time? And then the decision-making within our department, at least, is done by groups outside of our team and typically outside of the science and technology branch altogether. But like I said, we coordinate science advice that comes in a lot of different forms. Sometimes it's very informal, quick science advice that the department needs, 2 hours later. And our job is really to identify, okay, what expertise do we have within the department that could provide this advice? Or do we know someone external who might be available on really short notice? But there's other cases where we do have more lead time and the department is asking for something a little bit more formal and systematic, very much similar to the CSAS process that Paul described. And part of what our team is doing is trying to develop and implement a very similar systematic approach to producing science advice to that of CSAS. So essentially bringing CSAS with some organizational tweaks and make it fit our department. And so we've been working on that over the last 2 years. It's certainly not an easy task. DFO has a long history of doing this, over 40 years, and our department has essentially zero history of that, with the exception of some ex-DFO staff that end up working at ECCC, like myself, actually. And so our process that we're building and developing rests on many of those same principles that CSAS rests upon. So principles like scientific integrity, principles like transparency, impartiality, and especially timeliness. So making sure we can produce the best available advice given the time constraints that the government has for making a decision. And so I'll share a recent success of this process that we've been developing, piloting, building over the last 2 years. We recently ran a science advisory process on marbled murrelet, which is an endangered seabird with a range on the Pacific coast of British Columbia. They're a really interesting species, and they nest in essentially the canopy of old growth forests. And so they're very cryptic, very hard to find their nests. And also their terrestrial habitat can conflict with other land uses, especially forestry, right? Those large old growth trees are very valuable for other uses. And so the task that our science advice group was asked was, how can we identify the terrestrial critical habitat for the species as required under the Species at Risk Act? And so our team brought together a group of experts from within ECCC, from the BC government, from academia, from consulting, got together and discussed a bunch of different alternate models that could be used to identify terrestrial critical habitat. And we're ultimately able to suggest a single model that the experts agreed on was the most scientifically robust. So that's the evidence-informed piece of it. We brought that evidence, evaluated it, gave it to the decision makers, which in this case is the Canadian Wildlife Service, another branch of our department. And they have now adapted, they're taking that recommended approach, applying it and working towards an amendment to the recovery strategy for that species. So that scientific piece that we recommended will then be brought together with some other important information, socioeconomic information, legal information, Indigenous rights, land use rights, et cetera. And then there will ultimately be a designation of terrestrial critical habitat for that species. But I see this as a success because we were able to bring forward the kind of best available scientific information. And I think it'll lead to a good decision, or at least one in which it's very clear what the scientific evidence was. So much like CSAS processes, we also publish these reports, and so the public can see what evidence was made available.
Cool. Thank you. And before we go to Andrew, I'll just note that, if we had somebody from Parks Canada here, if we had somebody from Transport Canada, they would all tell you about a slightly different process. There is no one process that's consistent and exists across all federal agencies. That's something that Mona Niemer, the chief scientist of Canada, is aware of, and they've been really digging in, trying to identify what are those best practices and principles. And I think you heard some of those as well, that, they might, it's a different process, but it still what Cody talked about relative to what Paul, it still relies on, some of those key principles around transparency, making sure diverse voices are at the table, and so on. Andrew, let's jump to you.
Thanks, Steve. It's nice to hear your reflections there, Paul and Cody. And I think I heard very much what I would highlight in my case is the importance of transparency and acknowledging uncertainty in decision making. And Paul and Cody described a bit more complex decision making spaces across federal departments or agencies, whereas the work that I'm focused on is much more focused in scope. And Paul also talked about his example of braiding Western science and Indigenous knowledge. And in my context, it's not only a desirable outcome, but it's enshrined in legislation that our wildlife co-management decisions are informed by Inuit knowledge alongside Western science. And so in the case in which I work, successful evidence-informed decision-making would look like we're focusing on a specific herd or subpopulation of animal that's of interest for subsistence harvest or commercial harvest, and we are either maintaining that species abundance and population, or in the case of where we're looking towards outcomes and objectives of conservation, those numbers of in those species are increasing. And the example that I can talk about is one that I worked on recently, which is barren ground caribou on Southampton Island. So this is a quite large island at the entrance of Hudson Bay. And caribou are very much relied upon by the Inuit community in Coral Harbor. History of generations and generations of Inuit peoples relying on this animal. And in the 80s and 90s, the population experienced a sharp decline due to a commercial harvest as well as a brucellosis outbreak. And ever since the late 90s, the government of Nunavut, as well as with the local communities and other co-management partners, have been working very carefully to reach an outcome where the population of caribou is stable. So it's also a semi-closed ecosystem. Caribou do migrate back and forth from the mainland, but it's not very common. So it requires balancing, imagining what the carrying capacity for this animal is, knowing that there's finite resources. And since the population decrease in the 90s, government of Nunavut has been working closely to conduct aerial surveys of the population to make sure that the numbers have been increasing and setting total allowable harvests according to the population estimate. So the estimate is around 13 to 14,000 animals, and the government's taken a precautionary approach to managing harvests. So right now it's the total allowable harvest is 1,000 animals, and we've done a couple aerial surveys in the last 5 to 10 years, and we're slowly getting to see and think that that population is stabilizing in terms of its overall numbers, and that is based on Western science aerial surveys of those animals. But I recently went in and also gathered and synthesized the Inuit knowledge component of that as well, which is also suggesting a stabilizing or an increase in the population, which I think is going to lead to a successful outcome where the next time our co-management board, which is the Nunavut Wildlife Management Board, considers both the Western science and Inuit knowledge using a two-eyed seeing approach, exploring both Indigenous Inuit knowledge as well as Western science. That our evidence indicates that the population is increasing, and we can be a bit more. We can adjust the total allowable harvest to increase subsistence harvest in the community without compromising the longevity and sustainability of the caribou herd.
Great. Thanks, folks. And we started out there. I asked everybody for success stories, and I appreciate those. But, this is a challenging space to work in, right? This idea of evidence-informed decision-making, when the rubber hits the road, there can be challenges. And so that's what I want to dig into next. What are those key challenges of using evidence to inform environmental decisions? Is it challenges with the evidence? So we, of course, have that, this ideally pile of evidence over here. Or is it something to do with the decision-making space? Is it both? Is it something else? Going to start with Cody, then on to Andrew, and then Paul in that order.
Sure. Thanks, Steve. I think I'd maybe speak to two challenges that I see as pretty prevalent in the work that I do. And I think they both kind of sit in between, like they're not specific challenges to the evidence generation side of things or the decision-making side, but they really are kind of synthetic challenges. The first is that of scope mismatch. So this idea that while we have a lot of evidence and scientific evidence, specifically in the context that I'm thinking of, it's often not at the same scale that decisions are made. And so this can go both ways. Our department has a lot of national initiatives where we have to make policy or decisions that apply across the whole country. And often scientific studies are done more locally or regionally. And so we had to figure out how can we bring together a bunch of regional evidence and use that to inform a national decision. It can also go the other way, where we have to make a very small scale decision about permitting for a specific project at a specific site, and there aren't scientific studies or data relevant to that specific site. They may be from other areas, and can we still learn something from those but apply them there? But the other side of that is like really understanding from a decision-making side of things, like what scientific information might change a decision or might influence a decision. Because it's not, I feel like a lot of the decision makers we work with, they want their decisions to be evidence informed, but it's sometimes challenging them to frame what the specific scientific question is that they have for us. So that kind of is a challenge to know how can we provide information without just dumping, here's 30 papers on this subject, read them and inform yourself, I guess, and use that in a general way. So that's a challenge. The other challenge I'd like to speak to is, I think this is a bit of a consequence of the digital age, and maybe partially because of the attention given to science advice during the COVID pandemic. But I do feel like there's more scrutiny nowadays on individual experts and their opinion, and more of a push in many of the pieces of science advice that we're delivering to try to understand, okay, what's the consensus or the kind of the majority opinion of a group of experts, rather than historically there may have been more cases where the government could rely on their single independent science advisor. And so that brings a lot of challenges with it. We need to identify, okay, who should be involved? Are they available? How can we get them together? How can we bring them to a common group statement on advice, which aren't present when you just have, you know, that one relied upon expert that you can go to and get their opinion. And you know, I don't think this is all bad. Like sometimes individual experts do have competing interests or duties that may bias their advice. And so it is great when you can get a group of experts together and kind of some of that bias is washed out. You can really have a more robust examination of the evidence, but it does come with some consequences as well from the kind of operational logistics side of things.
Great. Thanks, Cody. And I think the other panelists are going to enjoy perhaps playing off of some of the things you said there. So over to you, Andrew.
Yeah, just in listening to Cody's response there, I don't have too much else other to say than that, just to echo what he was saying. But you know, my points were the same. When you ask the question of whether the problems are specific to evidence or the decision-making space, my answer would be both, based on the research that I've done in this space. And I'll just echo in terms of problems specific to the evidence. You know, what Cody talked about there was scope and scale mismatch, and often what I've heard from decision makers is specific mismatches in time scales where, you know, decisions are often urgent and made on short time frames and don't have time to wait for, you know, a couple of year study and for the, you know, publication to come out. The other challenge with evidence is often that it's quite inaccessible, and what I mean in terms of that is accessibility in terms of communicated in a plain language that's easy for anybody to understand, and you know, it's not a 20-page paper when you have to make a, you know, a really urgent decision. And so I think where there are going to be helpful advances in the evidence-informed decision-making space, and would be to synthesize and communicate evidence in accessible formats to decision-making spaces. And on the decision-making space front, Cody touched on it as well. I think, you know, we're in this post, you know, pandemic life where we have to be mindful that you know, a lot of evidence is under attack, or there's been a lot of misuse, misinformation, disinformation, and that's certainly a challenge. Is you know, is either the, you know, weaponization or politicization, I guess would be more appropriate, of evidence. And so that's where we talked about transparency and uncertainty, and acknowledging uncertainty being key elements of evidence communication. And then, you know, also in terms of the decision-making space, Cody touched on it a bit as well, in terms of, you know, evidence is not always going to be sole consideration when we're making decisions. And certainly some of the decision makers I've talked to, scientists I've talked to, say that in certain contexts, political and economic considerations often outweigh evidence-based decisions. And you know, that's you know, a problem when it is going against certain goals, specifically in conservation and environmental management, like, you know, conserving a species at risk.
Thanks, Andrew. So Paul, what did you learn in your 5 years with DFO as science advisor?
Oh my goodness. Well, I don't think we have enough time to get through all of that, but and I will also say some interesting points that Cody and Andrew have made here that I can riff off a little bit. I'd say one of the really big challenges that I see in terms of science advice is different pieces of scientific evidence can be weak or strong, and establishing the weight of evidence and dealing with uncertainty has to be part of that evidence presented, as does a clear explanation of why some lines of evidence can be stronger than others and how conflicting evidence was interpreted. The point on consensus, I think, is a really important one, and certainly one of the things that DFO strives for is to achieve consensus among CSAS review processes or within CSAS review processes. Usually that's possible, but occasionally it's not, and it doesn't reflect poorly on anybody involved, generally not. It may reflect that there can be multiple interpretations. And so again, as long as it's evidence-based, there is now room in the CSAS processes at DFO to acknowledge an alternative interpretation, but to explain why that alternative was not embraced as the final recommendation. And so that's one thought. We've also noted that decision making is not just based on science. And so I think as scientists, our real job, our main job, is to strive to ensure that we provide the clearest and the best scientific evidence available, and to be as clear as we can on that. In my view, I think the greatest challenge that we have beyond that is the effective translation of science advice to policy, the interface by which that information is taken up and hopefully digested and fully embraced in any decisions that are made. And so the best science advice in the world is not especially impactful if policy implementation does not give it full consideration. And so we as scientists really need to try and make sure it gets that consideration. There is a real challenge in communication and differences in language of disciplines, but also recognizing that non-science issues can sometimes outweigh the science advice as much as we would like to see science as the predominant factor in decision making. And so that same communication issue splits into public discourse as well, or it spills into it. Sometimes highly complex analyses, such as those used to estimate stock sizes, for example, can be really difficult to explain and thus difficult to defend, particularly when they contradict anecdotal observations that suggest that a stock might be healthier than the analysis might determine, for example. So these are some of the big issues that I see as a challenge.
Thanks, Paul. And you started taking us down that pathway of really that transfer, translation, mobilization, variety of words that have been used there. There is some debate about the role of scientists in that process versus the role of the decision maker. The old sort of pipeline model where you've got a knowledge generator on one end and the assumption is you've got a receiver, a decision maker at the other. That's sort of been dispelled. It's much more complicated of that. But what do we need to do to close the gap, recognizing that there is a gap, and that's been well described, well characterized, including empirically here in Canada in the environmental space. I'm going to start with Andrew, then to Paul, and we'll wrap up with Cody. And a reminder to folks in the audience, as I just pinged you in the chat, we'd love to hear from you with respect to your questions. So get those submitted, and we'll be looking at those momentarily.
Thanks, Steve. Yeah, and in asking this question in terms of, what are good pathways in terms of transferring knowledge to inform decisions. I've worked with and have, interviewed up to hundreds of people working in conservation, environmental management, decision-making spaces. And I think a lot of them will probably tell you that decision makers, whether they be, in the government context, this could be like directors, assistant deputy ministers, ministers, et cetera, are not likely the ones that are going to be going out of their way to seek scientific evidence, but this is just my perspective, and maybe Paul and Cody might have a different perspective. But these are people that are extremely limited by time with multiple, competing mandates or objectives in their work. And in my mind, I think the focus should be placed on the scientific end of the spectrum, and what I have seen in terms of approaches that can help transfer knowledge to inform decisions is something I mentioned previously in terms of evidence synthesis, but also other accessible forms of science communication, including policy briefs, plain language summaries. Also, I assume that a lot of people are on this panel because they either have published in CSP journals or have interest in publishing in CSP journals. And I think that there's more work to do than publish an academic journal paper that could be done. And I'm sure a lot of participants are familiar with Aaron Jacob, Dr. Aaron Jacob, who is the director of the Nature Conservancy of Canada for Science and Research. And, if you follow her on LinkedIn, she's a master of science communication. So whenever she publishes a journal article, she gets the word out in across social media. She's very active in publishing in alternative outlets like Policy Options or The Conservation. And so these are going towards, outlets towards traditional news media. And also in terms of producing science and generating scientific evidence, some of the work that I've done has shown that knowledge co-production or engagement with decision makers is extremely beneficial for transferring that knowledge to inform decisions. So if you have direct relationships with the folks that are going to be making use of this evidence, like that, you're much more likely to have it actually inform those decisions versus publishing in an article and then expecting somebody to go along and find it.
Great. Thanks, Andrew. And indeed, the genesis for this series is really what you described. How can we go from a publication and a publisher being more than that, and CSP sort of really tries to build community and extend that knowledge from the page to that decision making space. So cool. Cody, we're coming to you next, and I just want. Oh, sorry, no, we're going to Paul next. That's where we're going.
For sure. But was there something you wanted to add, Steve?
Oh, I was just going to say, when we get to Cody, he specifically mentioned that he used the word knowledge broker when he was describing his role. So when we get to Cody, we'll give him a heads up. I'd love for you to speak to that role a little bit more, Cody. I think that's something that would be worthwhile to expand upon. So, Paul.
Right. Okay. Well, I would say that in an ideal world that scientists and upper level managers really should seek each other out. But sometimes that search can be difficult for decision makers. There was mention earlier of timelines, which are often very tight. And certainly academics, we are not known for honoring timelines necessarily as quickly as government people. But I think as scientists, we must do our best to make our information available and to seek pathways to get that information into the hands of decision makers and in formats that they can use. Managers should try to ensure that there's a clear pathway to get that information to them and pay careful attention to that pathway. But I think for us, we need to know how to get to that pathway and to utilize it effectively. So, although a new paper that you published in Science or Nature might get managers or politicians' attention, it probably won't. And there's really a strong chance it will not. So particularly if that science is highly technical. So I think the key then is finding that pathway in the language that is most useful for policymakers. Keep knocking on doors, don't give up. Persistence and passion for your science will help. But I think the primary focus must be the evidence and of course not the advocacy. One of the other points that we might get into if we have some time is where people see themselves in that spectrum of advocacy versus objective advice. And I have my own views on it, but I'll hold on to those until and if we get to that point. So thanks.
Paul is foreshadowing where we're going to go with our first question. So we have an audience question in that space. Let's go to Cody. And if you can touch a little bit more on that knowledge brokering role and the role of knowledge brokers in the space, that would be fantastic.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, so I mean, the question was, part of it was sort of what, whether it's the role of scientists or decision makers to kind of find each other and seek out information and bridge that gap. And I guess I was already going to make a plug for the fact that that work is really difficult, I think. And so just to acknowledge that it's challenging both for knowledge generators and for knowledge users to find each other. And I think there is an important role for people that have a formalized role in knowledge brokering. So that's someone whose job it is to, try to understand what what an information need is, and to be able to seek out and pull together at least the people or the actual information and evidence to inform that. And so that's kind of my role at ECCC. But I think that's also baked into the role of probably thousands of public servants. Like anyone who has a role as a policy analyst, part of their job is, okay, what evidence might we have to support decision A or decision B? Our team's a little unique in that we sit in the science and technology branch, and so we're really specific to scientific evidence, and we're acting more of a push of information, but still sitting in between those two groups, the decision makers, which others spoke to are often the senior management within the kind of decision-making groups, and then the knowledge producers, which I would think about as our research scientists, academics, anyone that's doing kind of original scientific research. And there's a lot of aspects of that job that I think are unappreciated. One that I think probably a lot of academics and knowledge producers have been frustrated with is people moving around within the decision-making space, like people leaving one position, going to another position, maybe just after you've formed a relationship with them. Someone that's a full-time knowledge broker can do a good job of keeping track of, okay, well, this person's not there, or this person is now the acting manager for that group, so that's who I need to engage with. Which would be really challenging to do if you're trying to do knowledge brokerage off the side of your desk. So, beyond that, like understanding when you need to bring experts to bear to a question versus information. Like I can go and read scientific papers if they're with any kind of in my area of animal ecology, and I could summarize knowledge and bring it forward. And sometimes that's sufficient, and that's what we have time to do. But sometimes what I need to do is actually get Steve Cook and Paul Snellgrove on a call with a decision maker, and so they can tell that decision maker face to face what the evidence is supporting a decision. And so understanding those situations, I think, is really tricky for anyone on the outside. And there's a lot of other kind of nuance, I think, to the job that's really challenging for either side to do. And so, yeah, I mean, I'm very biased in this, and that it's my day job, but just a plug for how important I think that role is.
Fantastic. And thanks to our panelists for getting us here, and most importantly, generating some questions. So thanks to our audience for putting these up, and again, panelists for inspiring these. So of course, we don't necessarily need everybody to weigh in on every question here, hoping to be able to get through, and we'll try and keep our answers short and pithy so we can get as many of these in as possible. The first question comes from Sandra Clemnet-Nguson. Based on Paul's definition of evidence, I'm curious about the emphasis on no advocacy as a role of scientists. Is it only in the context of a science advisor? Isn't there a place and a need for advocacy? Paul, why don't you start us off with that one?
Oh yeah, nice easy question. Thank you, Steve. What I would say is I think it's a very personal decision as to how one wants to deal with that. The example I would use, and I use this with my own students, is I like to try to maintain objectivity and be seen as an impartial broker of information. And so I'm very comfortable making this statement as an example that there is strong evidence that bottom trawling compromises biodiversity and function in seafloor environments, because that's something I study. What I'm not comfortable doing is saying Canada should ban bottom trawling. And the reason I'm not comfortable with that is that I do not have deep knowledge of economics and social policies that are also relevant to any decisions going into that trawling ban. And so I'm very happy to talk about the science impacts on the environment, but less happy going further forward than that. But I realize others feel that they do need to say, yes, let's ban it. Let's go all in. But I fear that I will then be seen as somebody who's anti-trawling, and I can't be listened to in any conversation about trawling. So that's why I take that particular view. Thanks.
Yeah. And to summarize, if I may, Paul, it's trying to maintain that honest broker role, right?
Yeah,
There's something
exactly.
to be said for that as well. Cody, Andy, either of you want to jump in on this one?
I'll maybe just quickly add that there is, I think, a special role for public servants, and Paul probably felt this when he was the departmental science advisor for DFO, where there's a specific obligation to be kind of that impartial, honest broker. And people outside of the public service, I think, have more flexibility about whether or not they want to engage in kind of evidence-informed advocacy, and that can be very powerful. But I do see a little bit of less flexibility for public servants, where we're expected to really bring forward our the most impartial information that we can and try to be as objective as we can.
Anything to add there, Andy?
Not for me. I think yeah, Paul and Cody had great responses there. We can move to the next one probably.
Great. Got a question from Scott Findlay, and this is a question for Cody et al. Is not perhaps the most important issue for a knowledge broker to help both consumers and producers understand A, the most relevant questions, issues that need to be answered, and B, which of these questions are something to which scientific evidence can contribute? That is, questions of fact versus questions of value.
Yeah, I agree. I agree with most things that Scott says. I think that's a very important role for a knowledge broker is to try to help knowledge consumers really pin down what their scientific questions are, which often involves quite a bit of conversation, and it isn't a straightforward process. And yeah, so I totally agree. That's a very important role. And so, for example, we're this year piloting an intake process where we had an annual call out to our other branches for requests for science advice for next year. It's very similar to what CSAS does with their requests for science advice. And I'm expecting when we receive those requests, a number of them will not be clear scientific questions. And we're going to have to go back to those knowledge consumers and help them work through and understand, do they really have a scientific question here, or is it a values-based question that science ultimately isn't really going to be able to help answer?
Anybody want to add on to that, or can I move on to another question? Okay, I'm going to skip to another question here. We've got a question from Tim Elemenciak asking about what the panel thinks about the challenges and opportunities presented by generative AI as it relates to evidence synthesis, or perhaps more broadly in this evidence generation to evidence decision-making space. Who wants to take that one? Cody just took a challenging one. So, and Paul, Andrew, let's start with you.
Yeah, no, I can hop in on this quickly. I've also worked closely in one of the centers that's hosting this webinar, the Canadian Center for Evidence-Informed Conservation. For those of you who don't know, is also active in generating systematic reviews and meta-analyses of environmental issues. I haven't been super involved in this space in recent years, but have spoken to several researchers, academics that are involved in the evidence synthesis space. And obviously that's changing rather quickly in terms of AI generated tools and support. And what I've heard from them generally is that AI tools, GLMs, etc., are quite good at helping to find and screen relevant articles by title and abstract. It's just when you start to think about coding the evidence within those articles is often requires a critical and subjective eye, and so far, I think in terms of coding actual data and classifying it into certain bins is still not as helpful in terms of AI. So I think in terms of finding the relevant evidence, it's doing a pretty good job, but still not as good as human scoping when it comes to coding data.
I'm going to stop us there on that question. Thank you for taking that, Andy. I'm going to try and squeeze in one more here, folks, and I'm sorry we can't get to all of them. And that question was about the pitfalls that particularly, I think, early career folks need to be wary of in working in this space, both as, if they're very early career, they're probably still in that knowledge generation training phase in grad school, but as they also transition from in a variety of different roles that in that whole ecosystem. So thoughts, pitfalls, and maybe this is one we can hopefully hear from all of you very briefly. We've only got 2 minutes left. Paul, can I come to you first?
Sure. I think a couple of things there. One is to be very precise and careful in your wording, to say what you mean to say and not to say something that could be grossly misinterpreted. I think that's a real pitfall. A second potential pitfall, which occasionally young scientists may fall into, or even a senior scientist, is overstepping your knowledge. So in other words, getting into topics that you probably shouldn't be involved in. And I'm certainly approached by newspapers, and other venues asking me for information on something. And if I feel comfortable, I will tell them. But otherwise, I will say, I think you should talk to Steve Cook because he's got more expertise in that particular topic than I do. So those are two pitfalls I would identify. Thanks.
Thanks. Cody.
Yeah, I guess I think maybe one pitfall can be kind of sinking a lot of time and while it may be valuable as a learning experience, not ultimately producing any influence because you're not closely following what decisions the government's actually making at that time. And so, sometimes there's policy windows that open up where the government is discussing, making a decision, changing a policy, and that's when specific evidence in that area is important. But there's times when, the government's not thinking about changing a new law or changing a policy, and providing evidence related to that policy might not really have any impact because everybody's focused on something else at the moment. So just trying to keep track of what the government is doing. And, there's lots of ways you can do this through media, through official announcements, et cetera, can avoid the pitfall of kind of sinking a bunch of time into something that the government's not paying attention to at the moment.
Great, thanks. Andy, a 15-second pitfall, please.
I talked about knowledge co-production and engagement in terms of generating knowledge with communities. I think a big pitfall is coming up with a question in advance and then going to community afterwards and saying, "Hey, do you want to partner on this research?" Well, true co-production happens at the question generating phase that will ultimately make the research more impactful and beneficial for communities.
Yep, and that applies to communities. That applies also to working with decision makers in parliamentary governments and so on. So excellent. All right, huge thanks to all of you, our panelists. Big thanks to all the participants. I'm going to ping it back to Albana for a few closing words.
Thanks, Steve. And thank you again to our panelists. Thank you, Andrew, Paul, Cody, for your thoughts, for your time. It's been very helpful to learn, especially as an early career researcher, all the insights that go behind evidence decisions and what we have to think of moving forward. Thanks again to the panelists and to the participants. And we will be posting the recording on the Canadian Science Publishing YouTube channel soon for those who couldn't make it. So thanks again. And see you at our next webinar with Canadian Centre for Evidence-Informed Conservation. Bye, everyone.